The celebration had already begun. Supreme Commander Kaldoreth stood at the observation deck of the Undying Verdict, watching his crew exchange the Vreth equivalent of congratulations, a low, resonant clicking of mandibles, a ritual older than the Dominion itself. 41 civilizations, 41 compliance filings. His record was, as it had always been, perfect. He picked up the data slate. Earth, species designation, human, classification status, pending final transmission confirmation, compliant. He had not even bothered to watch the final phase execute. He never did, anymore. The outcome was mathematics. You applied the correct pressure to the correct fracture points, and a species folded. It was not cruelty. It was engineering. His communications officer, a young Vreth named Dasaketh, turned from her console with the easy confidence of someone filing paperwork. Supreme Commander, awaiting your authorization to transmit the compliance confirmation to Central Dominion. Kaldoreth raised one long finger. One moment. He wanted to savor it. Not from pride. Pride was inefficient, but because 41 was a number worth acknowledging. 41 species that had looked up at Vreth ships and eventually, inevitably, looked down. He opened his mouth to authorize the transmission. Then the console screamed. Not an alarm. Not a weapon lock. Something the Undying Verdict systems had no category for. An incoming signal, broadband, covering every frequency simultaneously, exploding out of the planet below like a sunrise made of sound. Dasaketh's hands froze above her console. Supreme Commander, she stopped. Started again. I'm reading a transmission from the surface. Planetary scale. I cannot classify it. Distress signal? No. Weapon frequency? No. Surrender broadcast? A long pause. The kind that meant something had gone wrong with the mathematics. It doesn't match anything in the database. Her voice had dropped to something close to a whisper. It appears to be voices. Millions of them. Unified. The sound filled the bridge. Kaldoreth had overseen the breaking of 41 civilizations. He had heard species beg, rage, weep, and go silent. He had heard every sound a sentient creature makes when it reaches the end of what it can endure. He had never heard anything like this. It was a song. He stood very still for a long time. The data slate in his hand, the one that said compliant, felt suddenly like a document written in the wrong language. What is that? He whispered. No one on the bridge answered him. 6 months earlier, it had all seemed so simple. The Vreth did not announce their arrival. They never did. Announcement implied negotiation, and the Dominion had not negotiated with anyone in 300 years. They simply appeared, one morning in March, every radar array on Earth screaming at once, every satellite feed cutting to static, and then the sky above 7 of the planet's largest cities turning the color of a bruise as Vreth atmospheric processors began their work. No ultimatum, no transmission, just the ships, hanging there like a sentence that hadn't finished yet. Sethravin watched the initial sensor sweep complete from her station aboard the Undying Verdict and felt the specific satisfaction she always felt at this stage. The data was almost insultingly clean. The species was divided into nearly 200 separate governing bodies that actively distrusted each other. No unified military command. No interstellar capability. No energy weapons beyond primitive projectile enhancements. Biological lifespan averaging 72 years. Less than a single Vreth administrative cycle. She began building the compliance architecture the same way she always did. Methodically, the way you dismantle a structure you intended to repurpose rather than destroy. Find the fracture lines. Apply pressure. Wait. Every species had fracture lines. Humans had an embarrassment of them. Religion, ethnicity, economics, geography, political ideology. They had been fracturing along these lines entirely on their own for the entirety of their recorded history. The Vreth wouldn't need to create divisions. They would simply need to widen the ones already there. She filed her preliminary report with a single-word confidence rating. Inevitable. 12,000 kilometers below, in a basement in Accra that smelled like solder and old coffee, Maya Osei was doing what she had been doing for the past 72 hours without sleep. Listening. She had 3 monitors, 2 salvaged radio receivers, 1 functioning satellite uplink that she was reasonably certain the Vreth hadn't located yet, and a notebook so full of handwritten frequency codes that the pages had started to bleed through each other. She was not military. She had never wanted to be military. 6 months ago, she had been finishing her doctorate in communications engineering, arguing with her advisor about signal propagation in low ionosphere conditions. Now she was the nervous system of a resistance network that covered 9 countries, and she had no idea if half the nodes on her map were still alive. She pressed her headset tighter and swept the dial. Static. Static. A breath suppression tone. She recognized its signature now, the way you learn to recognize a smell you hate. More static. Then, faint and improbable, cutting through the suppression like a needle through cloth. Music. She sat up. It was coming from somewhere in the Pacific. A single instrument, something stringed, she thought, though the signal was so degraded it was hard to be certain, and a voice. Male. Unhurried. Singing in a language she didn't speak over a frequency that had absolutely no business still being open. She grabbed her notebook, found the frequency, wrote it down with a circle around it, and 3 question marks. Then she did what she always did when something didn't make sense. She started pulling the thread. She traced the signal's bounce pattern. Whoever was transmitting was doing it from a moving vessel, small, low electromagnetic signature, probably wooden or fiberglass hull. The Vreth atmospheric sensors were calibrated for metallic mass. They were looking for tanks, aircraft, missile batteries. They were not looking for a fishing boat. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment, thinking about what that meant, about what other things the Vreth might not be looking for. Then she opened a new file on her second monitor and started it with a single label. Archive. She didn't know yet what she was building. She only knew that something needed to be saved. Not weapon schematics, not military intelligence, not the things you'd expect to matter at the end of the world. Voices. She wanted to save voices. She pressed record and tuned back to the fishing boat frequency, and the music filled the basement in Accra like something that refused to know it was supposed to be over. Setharavin's second preliminary report went to Kale Dorth 3 days after arrival. It contained one anomaly she had almost cut before filing. A footnote, really, something the sensor arrays had flagged and she had nearly dismissed as equipment artifact. Across the planet's surface, in the hours immediately following the Vreth fleet's appearance, human communication traffic had not decreased. It had surged. Not distress signals. Not military coordination. The content analysis was what had made her pause. Humans were transmitting personal messages, stories, recordings of music, images of their families, as if the arrival of an alien fleet had triggered not panic, but an overwhelming biological compulsion to reach out and touch every person they had ever known. She stared at the data for a long time. Then she filed it as statistical noise and moved on to Phase 1 deployment. She would think about that footnote again. Later, when it was too late for it to be just a footnote. Phase 1 was elegant in its simplicity. Setharavin had refined it across 38 deployments. 2 early conquests had required improvisation before the model locked into its current form. And it worked on a principle so fundamental she could have explained it to a child. Civilizations do not fall from the outside. They collapse from within. The Vreth did not need to destroy humanity. They only needed to remove the conditions that made humanity functional, and then stand back and watch the species do the rest to itself. Step 1. Silence. The Vreth communication suppression grid went fully active on a Tuesday, which meant nothing to the Vreth and meant everything to the 3 billion humans who woke up that morning to find their phones showing no signal, their internet returning nothing, their televisions broadcasting static, and the faces of the people around them suddenly the only information source left in the world. Step 2. Scarcity. Targeted disruptions to food and fuel distribution networks. Not enough to cause immediate mass starvation. That was crude, and crude methods produced unpredictable variables. Just enough pressure on supply chains to make people afraid there wouldn't be enough. Fear of scarcity, Setharavin's models showed, was more destabilizing than scarcity itself. The anticipation of loss fractured communities faster than loss ever did. Step 3. Despair. On the frequencies the suppression grid left deliberately open, emergency bands, low-power local broadcasts, the Vreth injected a steady current of curated hopelessness. Casualty figures, real and inflated. Images of destroyed infrastructure. The voices of captured officials, carefully edited to sound like men who had already given up. Not propaganda exactly. More like a carefully maintained weather system. An atmosphere in which hope had difficulty surviving. On paper, the results were textbook. 17 national governments collapsed or suspended operations within the first 3 weeks. Stock markets, where they still functioned, became irrelevant overnight. Global supply chains, already disrupted, began to fragment along national and then regional lines. Sethravin's compliance projection held steady. She updated her timeline. 8 weeks to full psychological readiness for formal subjugation terms. She was almost bored. And then the field reports started coming in wrong. The first anomaly came from a monitoring drone positioned over the ruins of what had been Sao Paulo's financial district. Sethravin reviewed the footage with the detached efficiency of someone checking boxes and stopped the playback at the 43rd second. She reversed it, watched it again. Then she pulled up the behavioral prediction matrix and cross-referenced what she was seeing against what should have been there. The matrix said, hoarding, territorial aggression, interpersonal violence as resource competition escalates, withdrawal of cooperative social behaviors. The drone footage showed a line of people, perhaps 200 of them, passing salvaged food containers hand to hand across 3 city blocks. Not trading, not exchanging, giving. An elderly woman at the front of the line was directing traffic with the focused authority of someone who had decided this was her job now, and no one had better argue with her about it. Behind her, on the blast-scarred wall of what had been a bank, someone had painted an enormous mural overnight. Sethravin zoomed in. It showed human figures, hundreds of them, rendered in colors that had no business being this vivid in a city under occupation, all facing the same direction, all with their hands raised not in surrender, but in something she couldn't immediately categorize. She flagged the footage and moved on. The second anomaly came from Karachi. A monitoring node had detected an unauthorized gathering in a damaged school building, a potential coordination point for resistance activity. Ronakith had recommended a strike. Sethravin had approved a surveillance pass first. The gathering was a classroom. An older man, perhaps 60, was teaching mathematics to 14 children using chalk on a section of wall that had been scrubbed clean for the purpose. The children had no supplies. 3 of them had visible injuries. Every single one of them was paying attention with the specific focused intensity of someone who has decided that learning this matters, right now, today, regardless of what is happening outside the window. Sethravin sat with that footage for longer than she should have. She couldn't explain what bothered her about it. Her models accounted for isolated acts of altruism. Every species produced them under stress, statistical outliers that did not affect the aggregate trajectory. But these weren't feeling like outliers. They were feeling like a pattern she didn't have the right lens to see yet. She filed both anomalies under statistical variance, non-critical, and told herself she'd revisit them after the 8-week mark. In Mumbai, Daro Vesh had not slept in 4 days and had stopped noticing. He was a civil engineer. Before the Vreth arrived, he had spent his days calculating load tolerances and drainage gradients, arguing with contractors about rebar specifications, drinking too much tea. He was not a leader. He had never wanted to be a leader. Leadership required a confidence in your own judgment that Daro had always found slightly suspicious in other people. But someone had to figure out the water situation, and he was the one who knew where the pipes ran. That had been week 1. By week 3, he was coordinating supply distribution across 11 districts using a system of chalk marks on broken walls and a network of teenage runners who moved faster and quieter than any vehicle still operating in the city. He had a map that existed only in his head because writing it down felt dangerous. He had a list of 12 people he trusted completely and 40 more he trusted provisionally, and a very short list of problems that he genuinely did not know how to solve. The Vreth suppression grid was at the top of that list. Because Daro could move food, he could move water. He could move medicine through a city that was slowly learning to breathe again despite everything pressing down on it from above. What he could not do was talk to anyone outside the city. He could not know if what was happening in Mumbai, this quiet, stubborn, entirely uncoordinated decision that people seemed to be making individually and simultaneously to simply keep going, was happening anywhere else. He needed to know he wasn't alone. He didn't know that 12,000 kilometers away, a woman in a basement in Accra was building something specifically for people like him. He didn't know that yet. But one of his runners, a 15-year-old named Priya, who had an instinct for functional electronics that bordered on supernatural, had found something in the rubble of a communications shop that she thought might be worth showing him. She set it on his makeshift desk, A door balanced across two concrete blocks, and he looked at it for a long moment. It was a radio receiver. Old. Analog. The kind that didn't need the internet or a cell tower or anything the Vreth could suppress, with a grid calibrated for digital signals. He looked at Priya. She shrugged with the particular eloquence of a 15-year-old who has just handed you the answer and is waiting for you to catch up. Darrow picked up the receiver, found a frequency that wasn't carrying a Vreth suppression tone, and started to listen. What he heard made him sit down slowly on the floor with the careful deliberateness of a man whose legs have stopped working from something that isn't pain. It was a voice. A woman's voice, calm and precise, reading coordinates and frequencies in a pattern that, if you knew how to listen, mapped the outline of a network that stretched across 9 countries and was somehow, impossibly, still breathing. He didn't know her name yet, but he picked up a pencil, found a clean piece of wall, and started writing. Keldoreth did not read Sethravin's anomaly reports. This was not negligence. It was architecture. He had designed his command structure specifically so that anomaly reports below a certain threshold never reached his desk. 41 conquests had taught him that junior analysts had a tendency to find significance in noise, to construct narratives from data points that were simply the natural turbulence of a species in the process of breaking. If he read every flagged variance, he would drown in the static of other people's uncertainty. He trusted the model. The model had never been wrong. So when Sethravin filed her 3rd anomaly report in as many days and it vanished into the middle tier of his command structure without reply, she was not surprised. She was, however, becoming something she had not been in 16 years of compliance work. Unsettled, she pulled up the Phase 1 metrics and ran them against her behavioral templates again. The aggregate numbers looked correct. Compliance trajectory was holding. Government collapse was proceeding on schedule. And yet every time she looked at the surface data, not the statistics, but the actual footage, the actual signals, the granular texture of what was happening on the ground, she felt the specific discomfort of someone reading a sentence that looks grammatically correct but somehow means the wrong thing. She requested a second drone sweep of Sao Paulo. The mural had grown. What had been a single wall the week before was now 3 connected buildings. The original image expanded into something vast and deliberate. A panorama of human figures rendered in every color available to people working with salvaged paint in a city under occupation, which turned out to be more colors than she would have predicted. More people had been added. More hands raised in that gesture she still hadn't classified. And at the bottom of the mural, in letters large enough for the drone camera to read clearly, someone had written a single line in Portuguese. She ran it through the translation matrix. We were here. She sat with that for a very long time. It was Ronakith who brought the cultural strike recommendation to Keldoreth, and Ronakith who presented it with the blunt efficiency that had made him the Dominion's most effective field commander across 11 campaigns. The psychological collapse is plateauing, he said, standing at parade rest before Keldoreth's command table, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who has never found a problem that couldn't be solved by sufficient force correctly applied. The suppression grid is functioning. The scarcity protocols are functioning. But the species is not responding to hopelessness the way the model predicts. They are producing cultural artifacts at an accelerating rate. Our behavioral analysts believe these artifacts are functioning as cohesion mechanisms. They are preventing the social fragmentation that should be occurring by now. Keldoreth looked at the data slate Ronakith had placed before him. Compliance at 94%. 3 points below projection. Solution: remove the cohesion mechanisms. Targeted strikes on cultural sites, monuments, libraries, places of communal gathering. The model predicts that destroying the symbols a species uses to maintain collective identity accelerates psychological collapse by a factor of 3. We have used this approach successfully on the Drevithi and the Salunkai. It should take no more than 2 weeks. Keldoreth authorized it with a single mark on the data slate. He did not ask Sethravin's opinion. The strikes began on a Friday. Maya heard the first one from her basement in Accra, not the sound of it. The basement swallowed most surface noise, but the sudden silence on 3 frequencies she had been monitoring, and then a burst of fragmented transmissions from her Lagos node that lasted 40 seconds before going dark. She checked her map. Lagos. The transmission had originated 2 blocks from the National Museum. She already knew what had happened before the drone footage confirmed it 40 minutes later. The museum was rubble. The Vreth hadn't needed a large strike. The building was old, and the structural tolerances had never been designed with alien energy weapons in mind. Maya sat with her headset on and her hands in her lap and breathed very carefully for about 30 seconds. Then she opened her archive file and kept working. Because here was the thing about Maya say that the Vreth's behavioral models would never have thought to account for, because it was not a military capability, and it was not a political structure, and it was not any category of resistance they had a framework for measuring. She had grown up in a family of storytellers. Her grandmother had kept the history of 4 generations in her memory because writing it down had not always been safe, and she had passed that history to Maya's mother, and Maya's mother had passed it to Maya, with the specific instruction that you do not let the things that matter disappear just because someone wants them to. You find another way to hold them. So while the Vreth were striking monuments and libraries across 7 continents, Maya was doing something that looked, on any sensor array, exactly like background static. She was collecting everything. Voice recordings sent through her network, stories, songs, oral histories, jokes, arguments, the specific sound of a market in Nairobi and a temple bell in Kyoto, and a street musician in Buenos Aires who had decided that the end of the world was not a good enough reason to stop playing. She was compressing them, encoding them, and routing them through Ikaika's Pacific frequency in fragments so small that even if any single fragment was detected, it would look like signal degradation. The archive was growing. She didn't know what she would do with it yet. She only knew it needed to exist. Ikaika Nahale had been a musician before the Vreth arrived, and he was a musician now, which might have seemed like a failure of adaptability if you didn't understand that for Ikaika, music had never been a hobby. It was the way he processed the world. It was the way he stayed sane. It was, in a very practical sense, the only skill he had that was keeping him from sitting in the bottom of his boat and staring at the water until something inside him went quiet in a way that wouldn't come back. He played every day, sometimes for hours. He had started broadcasting almost by accident, testing a transmitter he'd salvaged from a Coast Guard station, wanting to know if it worked, playing a few chords to fill the silence of the test. 3 days later, he'd received a response. Not a voice, a rhythm, tapped out in Morse code from somewhere to his northwest, which he had to look up because he'd never learned Morse code before, and it turned out neither had the person tapping it. So what came through was imperfect and partial and unmistakable. Still here, he had sat with that message for a long time, rocking gently on the Pacific swell, and then he had picked up his instrument and played something that he had not planned and could not have explained, and that came out of him like a door opening. After that, he broadcast every day without fail. His signal was growing. Not because he was broadcasting more powerfully. His transmitter was the same salvaged Coast Guard unit it had always been, but because other people were picking up his frequency and rebroadcasting it from their own salvaged equipment, passing it along the way people have always passed things along when official channels closed down. Hand to hand, person to person, each repetition adding its own small distortion, its own fingerprint, so that by the time Maya started routing her archive fragments through his frequency, the signal was already a composite thing, a patchwork of dozens of human hands, which meant it looked less like a coherent broadcast and more like natural interference in the electromagnetic spectrum. The Vreth sensors logged it as noise and moved on. But then the strikes hit the gathering places. In Istanbul, a mosque that had stood for 5 centuries. In Kyoto, 3 temples in a single afternoon. In Mexico City, a plaza where people had been meeting every evening to share food and information. One of the spontaneous community nodes that had emerged in the first weeks of the occupation, the kind the Vreth behavioral model had not predicted, and Seth Ravin had been quietly watching with growing concern. The plaza strike was the one that changed something. Not because it was the worst, it wasn't. Not because the casualties were the highest, they weren't. But because someone in Mexico City, in the hours after the strike, did something that spread across Maya's network faster than anything she had ever transmitted deliberately. They rebuilt the plaza table. It was a folding table, the kind used for community markets, and it had survived the strike in pieces that could be fitted back together if you were patient and had the right tools. A woman named Maya never learned her full name, only that people called her Tia Carmen, had spent 4 hours in the settling dust fitting those pieces back together, and when she was done she had put a handmade sign on it. and then she had gone home and come back with food. By evening, there were 200 people there. By the next morning, there were photographs, actual photographs, printed on salvaged paper with a salvage printer, of that table circulating through every node on Maya's network, passed hand to hand through the cities and towns and broken places where people were making their own versions of Tia Carmen's decision. The Vreth struck the plaza again. The table reappeared the next morning. Different table, same sign. Maya received a voice recording from her Mexico City node, a young man, maybe 20, out of breath like he'd been running, and she added it to the archive and sat for a moment with her headset on, listening to the sound of 200 people deciding that a table mattered enough to keep rebuilding. She thought about her grandmother, who had kept 4 generations of history in her memory because writing it down had not always been safe. You find another way to hold them. She pressed record and kept working. Setharavin filed her 9th anomaly report, and this time she did not label it statistical variance, non-critical. She labeled it urgent, behavioral model integrity. She sent it directly to Kale Dorothy's desk, bypassing the middle tier entirely, which was a breach of protocol significant enough that Ronakith sent her a formal reprimand within the hour. The report said, in the careful clinical language she had spent 16 years perfecting, that the Phase 2 strike protocol was not producing the predicted psychological outcomes, that the destruction of cultural sites was not accelerating social fragmentation, that preliminary surface data suggested it was doing something closer to the opposite. She included the footage of the rebuilt table. She included the Sao Paulo mural data. She included 17 other data points that she had been filing as noise and had now assembled into a pattern that she could no longer pretend was noise. At the bottom of the report, in language she had never used in 16 years of compliance work, she wrote, I believe we may be operating from a flawed foundational assumption regarding this species. I am requesting authorization for direct surface observation before Phase 3 is considered. Kale Dorith read the report. He denied the request. He updated the compliance projection and authorized Ronakith to begin planning Phase 3. He noted, in his own private log, that Setharavin was showing signs of what he had observed in 2 previous compliance architects over 41 campaigns, a kind of analytical exhaustion that caused experienced minds to find complexity where there was only the familiar, inevitable mathematics of a species running out of time. He made a note to rotate her off the Earth assignment after compliance was confirmed. He did not make a note about the rebuilt table. Setharavin submitted her rotation request before Kale Dorith could file his. Not a reassignment. A surface survey, classified as routine atmospheric calibration, which required a senior compliance officer's authorization signature and which Setharavin had very carefully ensured Ronakith had signed 3 weeks ago during a batch authorization review he had processed without reading individual line items. She had not planned to use it this way when she obtained it. She had simply learned, over 16 years in the Dominion's bureaucratic architecture, that you collected authorizations the way you collected tools, before you knew which one you'd need. She took a covert shuttle. For personnel, no weapons manifest filed, because filing a weapons manifest would have created a record, and she was not ready to explain this to anyone yet. She picked the landing site carefully. Not a city, not a resistance node. She had no confirmed locations, though she had suspicions about certain frequency signatures she had been tracking informally for the past 2 weeks. She wanted something small, somewhere the Phase 2 strikes had hit hard, somewhere that should, by every metric in her model, be as close to broken as a human settlement could get without tipping into full collapse. She chose a town in the Nagano prefecture of Japan. The drone footage had shown significant structural damage from 2 sequential strikes targeting a cultural gathering site in the town center. Population displacement of approximately 60%. Infrastructure rated at 31% functional. By Sethravin's own compliance metrics, it was exactly the kind of settlement that should be displaying terminal social fragmentation, the point at which a community stopped functioning as a community and became simply a collection of individuals competing for diminishing resources. She landed 2 kilometers out, in a cedar forest that smelled like nothing she had experienced in 16 years aboard the Undying Verdict, and walked in with her team in sensor-dampened suits that would read, to any human observer, as nothing at all. She almost turned back at the tree line. Not from fear. From the sound. She had expected silence, or something close to it. The silence of exhaustion. The silence of people who had nothing left to say to each other because saying things required a shared future to say them toward, and a settlement at 31% infrastructure functionality should not, by any reasonable behavioral model, believe it had a shared future. What she heard instead was a fire. Not the sound of fire itself, though there was that too, the low percussion of burning wood that her translator matrix identified before she consciously registered it. The sound around the fire. Voices. Not the voices of people in crisis, which she knew well, which had a specific acoustic quality compounded of fear and diminished lung capacity and the physiological signatures of sustained cortisol elevation. These voices had a different quality entirely. She stood at the tree line for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. She checked her suit's timer afterward, not because the time mattered, but because she needed something precise to hold on to before she could make herself move closer. The town's central gathering space had been a community hall. The Vreth strike had taken the roof and 2 walls. What remained was an open structure, 3 walls and a floor and the ghost of a ceiling, that approximately 60 humans had filled with salvaged furniture, strung lights powered by what appeared to be a hand-crank generator that 2 teenagers were taking turns operating at the edge of the gathering, and the specific organized chaos of a meal being shared across too many people for the available seating. They had cooked. Actual food, not emergency rations. She could see the preparation detritus, the improvised cooking equipment, the evidence of significant logistical effort toward the specific goal of making something that tasted like a meal rather than something that merely provided calories. The distinction struck her as important in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. An old man was speaking. She activated her translator matrix. He was telling a story. Something old. Her translator flagged several vocabulary items as archaic, pre-modern Japanese, the kind of language that existed now primarily in preserved texts. The people around him were listening with the focused attention she had last seen in the Karachi classroom footage, and she realized that this was a specific kind of human attention she had no adequate category for. Not the attention of people receiving information they needed. The attention of people receiving something they needed in a different way. Something her behavioral matrices had no field for. A child fell asleep against an adult's shoulder midway through the old man's story. The adult adjusted automatically, without looking, without interrupting their own conversation with the person on their other side. A gesture so small it would never appear in any sensor report. A gesture that Sethravin found she could not stop looking at. She had no category for it. Then the laughing started. The old man's story reached its end. She caught the final lines, something about a fox and a river and a bet that everyone knew the outcome of before it was told. And the gathering erupted in a sound she had heard in her drone footage but had never heard at ground level, never from inside the acoustic space of the thing itself. It was not the laughter of people who had forgotten their situation. She could see their situations in their faces, the injuries, the exhaustion, the specific hollowness around the eyes that prolonged stress produces in human physiology. They had not forgotten anything. They had decided something. She stood close enough now to see individual faces, her sensor-dampening suit rendering her invisible to their perception, and she looked at them one by one with the clinical attention she had brought to 38 compliance campaigns and felt her clinical attention fail her completely. Because she knew what she was looking for. She had been trained to identify it, had found it in every species she had ever processed. The specific micro-expression cluster that appeared on the faces of beings who had made their peace with defeat. A softening around the eyes. A particular stillness in the body. The physiological signature of a creature that has decided, below the level of conscious thought, that resistance is no longer worth the metabolic cost. She had never once failed to find it when the model said it should be there. She could not find it here. What she found instead was something her training had no name for. A quality in these faces that she could only describe. In the private notes she began recording in her suit's memory rather than in any official system, as settled. Not the settled quality of defeat. The settled quality of people who have looked at their situation from every angle and chosen, with full information, how they intend to stand inside it. She was afraid to file that observation officially because she did not know what it meant. She was more afraid that she was beginning to. She stayed for 3 hours. She watched them organize, not with the frantic improvisation of people in crisis, but with the low-key efficiency of people who had been doing this long enough that the coordination had become habitual. Roles had emerged, not assigned. She could see no evidence of formal authority structure, but chosen, the way things get chosen in groups that have been through enough together to know what each person is actually good at. A young woman was managing the medical supplies with a precision that suggested either formal training or the kind of education you get when the alternative is watching people die from preventable causes. An older man with a carpenter's hands was conducting quiet structural assessments of the damaged walls, running his palms along load-bearing points with the focused attention of someone who understood that the roof situation was not acceptable and intended to do something about it. Two children were teaching a third to play a game using pebbles and a grid scratched into the floor. Setharavin stood in the middle of it all, invisible and increasingly uncertain, and understood for the first time that her model had not been generating bad predictions because of bad data. It had been generating bad predictions because it was asking the wrong question. Every behavioral model the Dominion used was built on a single foundational premise she had never once questioned because it had always, across 38 campaigns, produced correct results. That under sufficient pressure, any social species would prioritize individual survival over collective function. That fear, at sufficient intensity, was solvent. That it dissolved the bonds between individuals and reduced them to their component parts, isolated, manageable, compliant. She stood in a ruined community hall in Nagano Prefecture and watched 60 humans who had lost nearly everything function with a collective coherence that was not decreasing under pressure. It was increasing. She made no official report. She walked back to her shuttle through the cedar forest in the dark, recording private notes in a voice just above a whisper, and when she reached the shuttle she sat in the pilot's seat for a long time without initiating the launch sequence. Her team said nothing. They had learned, in the hours since landing, that something had happened to their superior officer that they did not have the vocabulary to describe, and they had the wisdom to be quiet about it. Finally, she initiated the sequence. As the shuttle lifted and the lights of the damaged town fell away below her, she looked down at them through the viewport. 60 small fires of human occupation in the darkness, refusing, with complete apparent sincerity, to go out. She thought about the compliance projection. 96%. 3 weeks to full submission. She thought about the rebuilt table in Mexico City. She thought about the child falling asleep against the adult's shoulder and the automatic adjustment that followed. Then she thought about Kale Dorith, who had denied her surface survey request, whose compliance projection said this planet was nearly finished. She opened a new file, labeled it with no title, began to write, not a report, something closer to a warning. She just didn't know yet who she was writing it for. The order came down on a Wednesday. Kale Dorith filed it with the same economy of language he brought to everything. 3 sentences, a target list, an execution timeline. Phase 3. Total cultural erasure. Ronakith was authorized to begin immediately. The target list was comprehensive in the way that only something designed by a very intelligent mind operating from a completely wrong premise can be comprehensive. Every major library still standing. Every broadcast tower still transmitting. Every remaining signal infrastructure of any kind. Relay stations, community antennas, the jury-rigged networks that had been sprouting across the planet's surface like the Dominion's suppression grid was fertilizer rather than poison. Every cultural institution the Phase 2 strikes had missed or only partially damaged. The model said this would work because it had always worked. When you remove the mechanisms a species used to tell itself its own story, the species stopped believing the story. And a species that had stopped believing its own story had nothing left to fight for. Ronakith read the order with the focused satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for permission to stop being subtle. He began with the broadcast towers. Maya heard the first tower go down at 3 a.m. Not the strike itself. The strikes were silent from ground level. Energy weapons that didn't announce themselves the way explosions did. What she heard was the death of the signal. A frequency she had been monitoring for 6 weeks. One of her most reliable relay points. A tower outside Nairobi that a retired electrical engineer named Joseph had been maintaining with spare parts and ingenuity and the specific stubborn competence of a man who had spent 40 years keeping things running and saw no reason to stop. The frequency simply stopped. She stared at the gap in her signal map for a long moment. Then Dakar went dark. Then Bogota. Then the relay station outside of Kolkata that Darrow's network had been using to push signals north into the mountain communities where people were otherwise completely isolated. She watched her map go dark the way you watch something you built with your hands come apart, with a specific quality of pain that is different from other pain because it contains, underneath the loss, the memory of every hour that went into the making. She kept her headset on, kept sweeping frequencies, kept her hands moving across her equipment with the automatic efficiency of someone who has decided that stopping is not one of the available options. At 4 a.m., the strike hit her building. Not a direct hit. Direct would have been simpler. It was a proximity strike on the communications tower 4 blocks away. A tower she hadn't even been routing through, had assessed weeks ago as too exposed and too obvious. And the shockwave came through the basement wall like a fist, knocked her equipment off the shelves, knocked Maya off her chair, and brought a section of ceiling down across the corner where her main transmitter had been sitting. She lay on the floor for a moment, listening to the settling sounds of a building that had just decided how much of itself it was willing to lose before it reconsidered its structural commitments. Then she did an inventory. Left hand, functional. Right hand, bleeding from somewhere. She couldn't see the cut in the dark, but she could feel it, not serious. Head, impact. She'd hit the floor hard enough to see light. She ran through a rapid self-assessment and determined she was probably not concussed, though she acknowledged she was not the most objective evaluator of her own neurological status. Legs, functional, though her left knee had found a piece of debris during the fall and was registering a strong complaint. She got up. The main transmitter was gone. The shelf it had been sitting on was gone. The section of wall behind it had a crack in it wide enough to put her hand through, and the ceiling above showed the specific sag of a structure that was still standing because it hadn't made up its mind yet. She looked at the gap where her transmitter had been. She thought about 6 weeks of work. The archive, every voice she had collected, every fragment she had encoded and routed and saved. Her stomach dropped somewhere foundational before she remembered. The archive wasn't on the transmitter. She'd been storing it distributed across the network, fragments pushed out to every node as fast as she compiled them, because she had grown up in a family that understood you never keep everything in one place. The archive was still out there, but her ability to transmit it wasn't. She sat in the debris of her basement in Accra and felt the weight of that for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was about 45 seconds, and then she picked up the one receiver that had survived the collapse because she had bolted it to a structural beam 3 weeks ago for precisely this category of reason, and she started to listen. What she heard made her sit very still. The Vreth had taken down the towers. They had struck the broadcast infrastructure across 7 continents with the systematic thoroughness of people who understood that communication was the nervous system of resistance and had decided to sever it completely. But they had built their suppression grid for the infrastructure they could see. They had not built it for what humans had been building in the dark. The first signal she found was coming from somewhere in rural Portugal. Low power, handmade antenna. She could tell from the signal's specific imperfections, the kind of imperfections that come from wire wound by hand rather than calibrated equipment. Someone had built their own transmitter, not a professional. Someone who had found instructions somewhere, or remembered something from a class, or simply worked it out from first principles because the alternative was silence. She found another one, northern Canada, then rural India. She thought it might be near Darrow's network, though she couldn't be certain. Then 3 more in quick succession from locations across South America. They were everywhere. Not the professional relay network she had built. Something else. Something that had been growing in parallel, quietly, in the months since the occupation began. People salvaging components from dead electronics, from cars, from anything that had once moved current through wire and building, with varying degrees of skill and success, their own means of reaching out. She understood then what had happened. Her network had been teaching people without meaning to. Every transmission she'd sent, every frequency she'd established, every routing technique she'd used, people had been listening and learning and replicating. Not because she'd asked them to, not because there was a plan, because humans, when they observe a technique that solves a problem they have, copy it. Immediately, instinctively, the way they have always copied things across the entire span of their existence as a species. The Vreth had destroyed her transmitter. What they hadn't destroyed, what they hadn't even seen, was the 6 weeks of accumulated knowledge that her network had distributed across thousands of human minds without anyone filing a report about it. She started transmitting on the receiver's limited output. It wasn't much, but it was something, and something connected to something, and something connected to something was how networks worked. Within 20 minutes, she had 17 connections. Within an hour, she had 43. Darovesh lost his Kolkata relay at 4:17 a.m. and spent the following 3 hours doing what he always did when something stopped working, which was figure out what was still working and build from there. What was still working was Priya, who appeared at his door at 4:30 a.m. with 3 salvaged radio components, a car battery, and the expression of someone who has already solved the problem and is waiting for the adults to catch up. She had apparently been maintaining a secondary transmitter in the building 2 streets over for the past month, on the operational theory that having only one of anything was a planning failure, a principle she had absorbed from watching Daro run the supply network. He had taught her that without knowing he was teaching her. He looked at her for a moment with the specific emotion that experienced people feel when the next generation turns out to have been paying attention. "Show me," he said. She showed him. By 6 a.m. his network was back, smaller than before, operating on lower power, but restructured in a way that was more distributed and therefore harder to kill with a single strike. He spent the morning redesigning the whole architecture on that principle. Not a network with a center, but a network that was all edges, every node capable of functioning independently and connecting laterally, so that removing any part of it would not collapse the whole. He had learned this, without knowing he was learning it, from watching what happened every time the Vreth struck something. The thing came back different. The new version was always harder to strike again. He thought, as he worked, about the problem of evolutionary pressure. He was not a biologist. He was a civil engineer. But he understood, in the practical language of structures and systems, what it meant when a force kept trying to destroy something and the something kept coming back stronger. It meant the force was not destroying it. It was refining it. Ikaika Nahale lost his Coast Guard transmitter at 5 a.m. A drone strike, precise and final, that took the equipment and left the boat intact, which told him the Vreth had been tracking the signal for a while and had simply been waiting for the authorized order to act. He sat in the rocking boat for a long time, looking at the space where his transmitter had been. Then he went below and found the components he had been collecting for the past 3 weeks. Not because he had anticipated this specifically, because he was on a boat in the Pacific Ocean, and boats in the Pacific Ocean have a way of making you think about redundancy. The new transmitter was smaller, lower power, different frequency characteristics. He tested it. It worked. He started playing. Within 6 hours, 3 other signals had found his frequency and begun rebroadcasting it. Then 7. Then more than he could count. The signal was distributing itself across a web of salvaged equipment and human stubbornness that the Vreth had not modeled because they had not known it existed, because it had not existed 3 weeks ago. Maya found his signal at 9 a.m. and made a sound she had not made in 6 weeks. Something close to a laugh. She routed her archive connection through his frequency and began the final compilation. Everything she had collected. Every voice, every fragment, every piece of what humanity had been reaching toward each other with across the silence the Vreth had tried to impose. She worked through the rest of the day without stopping. At 11 p.m., she began the transmission. Not to any specific recipient. On every frequency simultaneously, the ones she had built, the ones that had grown without her, the ones Ikaika was carrying across the Pacific, the ones Daro's network was distributing across South Asia, the ones that had been growing in the dark in Portugal and Canada, and 1,000 places she had never heard of. She pressed transmit, and 6 months of humanity pressed back. The signal hit the Undying Verdict sensor array at 23:14 ship time. Dasaketh was the first to register it, and the reason she didn't immediately classify it as a threat was the same reason no Vreth system flagged it for 11 seconds. 11 seconds being, in the context of a vessel whose threat response architecture could identify and target a hostile projectile in 0.003 seconds, an eternity of confusion. It didn't look like a weapon. It didn't look like a distress signal. It didn't look like anything in the database, which was a database compiled across 41 civilizations and contained every category of transmission a sentient species had ever produced in the final stages of a compliance operation. Surrender broadcasts. Desperate military coordination. religious invocations. The specific acoustic signature of a species making its last collective sound before going quiet forever. It looked like all of those things and none of them, and it was coming from everywhere simultaneously. And it was the largest single transmission event the Undying Verdict sensors had ever recorded from a planetary surface, and it was a song. Dasaketh pulled her headset off instinctively, the way you pull your hand back from something unexpectedly hot. Then she put it back on, listened again, ran the signal through 4 different classification matrices. The 4th matrix returned a single result, unknown. She turned to the command deck. Supreme Commander. Kale Dorith heard it and felt something he had not felt in 41 campaigns. He could not immediately name the feeling because it was not in the emotional vocabulary of a being who had spent 3 centuries ensuring that every situation he encountered resolved in a direction he had already anticipated. It was not fear. He knew fear, had observed it in others, understood its physiological and behavioral signatures. It was not anger. It was not confusion, exactly, though it contained confusion the way a storm contains water. It was the feeling of a foundational certainty beginning to crack. Not shattering, not collapsing, a crack. The kind that appears in a structure that has been load-bearing for so long that it has forgotten it is possible for the load to exceed its design parameters. He stood at the observation deck and listened to the song of a planet that was supposed to be compliant, and felt the crack spread through 41 campaigns worth of absolute certainty, and did not move and did not speak. Ronakith appeared at his shoulder. "It's a morale broadcast," Ronakith said, with the confidence of someone who needs everything to be a thing he already has a category for. A final gesture. Species sometimes produce them in the terminal compliance phase, a collective expression of defiance before submission. It's documented in the Drevathi case. It means they're breaking. Kildorith said nothing. "We should ignore it," Ronakith continued. "Responding would imply it warranted a response. The compliance projection reaches 100% within." "Leave," Kildorith said. Ronakith left. Setharavin had been in her quarters when the signal hit, reviewing her private notes from Nagano, the ones she had never filed, the ones that had been accumulating for weeks in a file she had not yet decided what to do with, and she felt it before she heard it. A change in the ship's acoustic signature, the specific shift in ambient sound that comes when every crew member on a vessel simultaneously stops what they are doing. She put her notes away and went to the signal analysis station. She had been doing this long enough that she didn't need to run the standard classification matrices. She could see what the signal was structurally, the layering of frequencies, the distributed origin points, the way it was being carried simultaneously on hundreds of different transmission architectures, each one slightly different, each one bearing the fingerprint of the human hands that had built it. She began mapping it. The mapping took 40 minutes, and in those 40 minutes she did not look up from her console, and did not speak to anyone, and barely breathed. What she found was this. The transmission was not being broadcast from a single source, or even a network of sources in any conventional sense. It was being broadcast from every piece of functioning transmission equipment on the planet's surface simultaneously, professional infrastructure where it still existed, and salvaged equipment where it didn't, an equipment that should not have worked at all by any reasonable engineering standard, but was working anyway because someone had wanted it to badly enough. The frequencies the Vreth had used for their suppression grid. The frequencies they had used for their despair broadcasts. The frequencies they had used to coordinate the Phase 3 strikes. Every tool the Dominion had deployed against this planet, every channel they had opened, every bandwidth they had occupied, had been studied, mapped, and repurposed. The humans were broadcasting on the Vretha's own frequencies. Using the Dominion's communication architecture as a carrier for a signal the Dominion had spent 6 months trying to prevent. Setharavin sat with that for a long time. Then she began analyzing the signal's content, and this was where her professional composure, which had survived 16 years and 38 compliance campaigns, and the Nagano Community Hall, and the rebuilt table in Mexico City, and every anomaly report she had ever filed and never had answered, finally and completely left her. She had expected, if she was honest with herself, a battle cry, an anthem, something defiant and declarative, the kind of transmission a species makes when it wants to announce that it has not been defeated, which was a known behavioral pattern, documented, classified, understood. Species made those transmissions. It meant they were in pain and wanted the thing causing the pain to know they were still standing. This was not that. What Maya Osei had compiled and transmitted across the rebuilt, salvaged, stubborn, unkillable network of human communication was not a declaration of war. It was not a declaration of anything. It was a record. 6 months of humanity, reaching toward itself across every silence the Vreth had imposed. The voice of the man in Karachi teaching mathematics on a clean section of wall. Ikaika Nahale playing into the Pacific dark. The woman in Mexico City. Maya had found her name by then. Carmen Reyes, 63 years old, former schoolteacher, describing in a voice of absolute ordinary calm how she had found the pieces of the table and put them back together because a table is a place where people sit together, and that seemed like the kind of thing worth keeping. The old man's story in Nagano, archaic Japanese vocabulary and all, his voice carrying the specific acoustic quality of someone who has told a story so many times it has become part of the air around him. Children's voices, market sounds, a temple bell, someone arguing about the best way to repair a water pipe, 2 people who clearly disagreed, but were clearly going to figure it out anyway. A lullaby sung by a woman whose name Maya had never learned, transmitted from somewhere in the Atlas Mountains, her voice so close to the receiver that you could hear her breathing. Daro Vesh, who had never spoken publicly in his life, who had spent 6 months moving through his city like a quiet structural force holding things together, describing in a voice of tremendous understatement what he had seen human beings do when you removed everything except each other. 6 months of proof, not of resistance, of something that had no adequate word in the Vreth language, or possibly in any language, but that Sethravin found herself trying to name anyway, sitting at her console on the undying verdict with tears running down a face that had not produced tears since she was a child. The closest word she could find in her own language was Thurakvin. It meant, approximately, the thing that remains when everything removable has been removed. She went to the command deck. Kildorith was still at the observation deck, still listening. He had not moved in 40 minutes. His compliance data slate was on the floor beside him, face down, and she did not think he had noticed dropping it. She stood beside him for a moment, listening to the song of a planet that had taken everything the Dominion knew how to do and converted it into this. Then she said it, not loudly, not with the drama of someone making a speech, in the quiet voice of someone reporting a finding to a colleague, which was all she had ever been and all she had ever wanted to be. We didn't break them. She paused. Let the signal fill the space. We built them. Kildorith turned to look at her. His face did something she had never seen a Vreth face do. Not in 16 years. Not in 41 campaigns worth of footage and field reports and the accumulated documentation of species meeting their end. It did nothing. Not the nothing of blankness. The nothing of a face that has reached the end of the expressions it knows how to make and found nothing waiting there. The model, he said. His voice was careful in the way that things are careful when they are very close to breaking. The model predicted. The model was built on an assumption we never tested. She said it gently, the way you say things to someone who is going to need time with what you're telling them. We assumed fear divides. For every species we have ever encountered, fear divides. We built 41 campaigns on that assumption, and it was always correct. She looked at the planet below, still singing. We never encountered a species for whom fear is a bonding agent. She paused. Every act of suppression we deployed, every blackout, every strike, every broadcast of hopelessness, we were not applying solvent to their social bonds. We were applying heat. She chose the word carefully, knowing he would understand the metallurgical implication. We were not dissolving them. We were forging them. The signal continued. Kildorith picked up his data slate from the floor, looked at the compliance projection. 96%. Frozen there for 3 weeks. Frozen there, she now understood, not because the model was almost right. Because 96% was as high as it was ever going to go. The remaining 4% wasn't a rounding error. It was load-bearing. We activated them, he said quietly. It was not a question. We activated them, she confirmed. Kildorith stood at the observation deck for a long time after Sethravin left. The song continued. It had been playing for 3 hours and 17 minutes without interruption, and his communications team had stopped trying to classify it and had begun, without receiving any order to do so, simply listening. He noticed this and said nothing about it. He was not certain he could have formed the words. He had built his career, his identity, if he was being precise about it, and he was always precise, on the understanding that conquest was a science. Not a brutal science, not a cruel one, a clean one. You studied a system, identified its failure modes, applied calibrated pressure, and the system resolved into a new configuration that was stable, manageable, and permanent. He had done this 41 times. The science had never failed. He was standing inside the 42nd time, listening to the sound of his science failing, and he was trying to understand not just what had gone wrong, but what category of wrong it was. Because there were failures he knew how to process. Equipment failure, intelligence failure, logistical failure, failures with names, failures that pointed back to correctable errors in the process. This was not that kind of failure. This was the kind that pointed back to the process itself. He thought about the 41 civilizations that had complied. He thought about them with a specificity he had not applied in years, not as data points, not as entries in a record, but as what they had actually been. Species, peoples, worlds with their own songs, if they had made songs, their own tables, if they had made tables, their own fires lit against the dark. He thought about what the Dominion's compliance protocols had actually done to those worlds. He had never thought about it in those terms before. He was thinking about it now, and the thinking was very uncomfortable, and he recognized the discomfort as important and still could not stop. The question that was forming in his mind was one he could not file a report about, could not discuss with Ronakith, who would not understand it, could barely discuss with Seth Ravin, who had arrived at a version of it weeks ago and had been carrying it alone since. The question was, what if the model had always been wrong and the 41 worlds had simply not had the specific combination of properties required to demonstrate it? He set the question aside. He set it aside the way you set aside something very heavy. Not because you intend to leave it there, but because you need both hands free for what comes next. What came next was a decision. Ronakith received the summons at 0300 ship time and arrived at the command deck with the alert readiness of someone who assumed a summons at 0300 meant escalation. He was carrying a target assessment for Phase 4, a proposal he had been developing for the past week, which had not been authorized but which he had prepared because preparation was a virtue and because he had absolute confidence that Phase 4 would eventually be authorized. He set it on the command table. Keldorith looked at it for a moment without touching it. The signal, Ronakith said. I've been reviewing the analysis. I believe it's a psychological operation, a deliberate attempt to project unity they don't actually possess. The compliance numbers tell the real story. 96% is not a failure. It's a population that is functionally subjugated. The remaining 4% is. Sit down, Keldorith said. Ronakith sat. Tell me about the Drevithi, Keldorith said. A pause. Ronakith had not expected this. The Drevithi, conquered in the Dominion's 19th campaign. Full compliance achieved in 11 weeks. Standard protocol. Their cultural transmission rate at the point of compliance. Another pause. Ronakith was a field commander, not an analyst. He dealt in targets and timelines, not behavioral metrics. I don't have that figure immediately available. I do, Keldorith said. 0. By the time the Drevithi reached compliance, their cultural transmission rate, the rate at which they were producing and sharing cultural artifacts, had dropped to 0, which is what the model predicts, which is what the model defines as the behavioral signature of successful compliance. He looked at the planet below. What is humanity's current cultural transmission rate? Ronakith said nothing. It is the highest we have ever recorded from a species under active compliance protocol, Keldorith said. Higher than their pre-contact baseline. The pressure we have applied has not decreased their cultural output. It has increased it by a factor of 7. Ronakith looked at the Phase 4 proposal on the table. Then we apply more pressure. We have been applying more pressure, Keldorith said with a patience that was very close to something else. For 6 months. With each application of pressure, the output increases. With each increase in output, the social cohesion increases. With each increase in social cohesion, the resistance to the following application of pressure increases. He paused. Tell me, Ronakith, what is the word for a process that makes a thing stronger each time you try to destroy it? Ronakith had no answer. I have been trying to find the correct word in our language, Keldorith continued. I cannot find one. I believe we do not have one because we have not needed one before. He picked up the Phase 4 proposal and set it aside. Not dramatically, Just aside, we are not going to apply more pressure. Ronakith left the command deck 40 minutes later looking like a man who has had the architecture of his understanding rearranged without being given a new floor plan. Setharavin, who had been observing from the analysis station, waited until his footsteps faded before she crossed to the command table. Kildorith was looking at the withdrawal calculation she had quietly prepared 3 days ago and left on his table without comment. The way you leave something in a place where someone will find it when they're ready to find it. You prepared this before I asked for it, he said. Yes. How long ago? 5 days. He looked at the calculation for a long time. Fleet repositioning. Atmospheric processor withdrawal. The logistics of extracting 41 ships from a planetary engagement without triggering the kind of surface response that could damage the fleet during departure. It was thorough. She had done it very thoroughly. The Dominion will require an explanation, he said. Yes. I will need to tell Central Command that we are withdrawing from a species that has not formally defeated us, that has no fleet, that has no energy weapons, that is, by every conventional military metric, incapable of forcing our withdrawal. Yes, she said. That is what you will need to tell them. A long silence. What do I tell them? Setharavin thought about the community hall in Nagano, the child falling asleep, the automatic adjustment, the thing she had not had a word for until she found Thurak Vin, the thing that remains when everything removable has been removed. She thought about Carmen Reyes and her folding table, about Ikaika playing into the dark, about Daro Vesh running supply lines through a broken city with chalk marks and 15-year-old engineers, about Maya, whose name she had found in the signal's architecture. The signal bore her fingerprints everywhere, in the encoding, in the routing logic, in the choices about what to save and what to carry and how to carry it. She thought about what 41 civilizations might have looked like if the Dominion had ever encountered one of them on the other side of this question. Tell them, she said carefully, that the standard compliance model is inapplicable to this species. That continued engagement would require the development of entirely new protocols, the timeline for which cannot be determined. That from a resource allocation standpoint, withdrawal and reclassification represents the most strategically sound path forward. Kildorith considered this. That is a carefully constructed way of saying we lost. It is a carefully constructed way of saying we encountered something we didn't have a category for, she said. Which is true, and which is, in my professional opinion, more important than whether we call it losing. He authorized the withdrawal at 0500 ship time. The fleet began pulling back at dawn, Earth time. Maya saw it on her receiver, not the ships themselves, but the change in the suppression grid, the frequencies opening one by one like windows in a building where someone had finally decided to let in the air. She sat in her debris-filled basement and watched the signal map change and did not quite believe what she was seeing until the third frequency opened, and then the fourth, and then she pressed her headset against her ears and listened to the sound of a planet exhaling. She reached Daro on the newly opened frequency within minutes. His voice was the same as it had always been, precise, understated, carrying its exhaustion the way a structural beam carries weight, without complaint, as a simple fact of its function. Is it over? He asked. She looked at her signal map, at the hundreds of handmade transmitters still broadcasting, still carrying the archive, still singing. I don't think it ever ends, she said. I think it just changes what it is. A pause. She could hear, faintly, the sound of Mumbai behind his voice. The city, breathing. I can live with that, he said. She found Ikaika's frequency next. He was still playing. She didn't interrupt. She just listened for a while. Out there on the Pacific, his signal bouncing off the newly reopened ionosphere with a clarity it hadn't had in 6 months, reaching further than it had ever reached, finding receivers she didn't know existed in places she had never transmitted to. She thought about her grandmother. You find another way to hold them. She had found a way, and the way had held. She began a new file. Not archive. Something else. She sat for a long time trying to find the right label for it. And finally she typed 2 words and pressed save and leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes and listened to the world come back online around her. The file was labeled, What's Next? Setharavin filed the reclassification report from the Undying Verdict as the fleet crossed the outer boundary of Earth's solar system. It was a standard form. She had filed 41 of them. Species designation, engagement summary, Final compliance status, category assignment. She had always found the category assignment the most satisfying part. The moment a species was formally placed into the Dominion's taxonomy of the conquered, given its permanent label in the database of things the Dominion had encountered and resolved. She filled in every field with her usual precision. When she reached the category assignment field, she sat for a moment. The standard categories were listed in a drop-down that had not been updated in over a century because it had never needed to be. Compliant, resistant, ongoing, resistant, suppressed, extinct, engagement cost, extinct, pre-contact. She closed the drop-down. She typed a new category directly into the field, which the form's architecture technically didn't allow, and which she did anyway, because some things needed to exist even if the system wasn't designed for them. She filed the report. She looked at the words she had typed for a long time before she closed the file. Out in the dark between stars, 41 ships turned away from a small blue planet that was, even now, still singing. The word was irreversible,